with Mrs. Lincoln's friends as he promised he would in the hallway. So at 8:40 a.m., President Kennedy leaves his hotel suite and he meets with Mrs. Lincoln's friends in the hallway. And she later was quoted as saying about that, she said, he gave his usual pleasantries. He said he was pleased to meet them and that any friend of mine were friends of his. He then looked out of the window and commented about how many people were down there. The size of the crowd pleased him. So a lot of people that couldn't get tickets for the breakfast speech came in and waited hours for him to come out and give this impromptu speech. Well, at 8:45 a.m., he went outside to the parking lot platform for his speech. Now, he had this put together. Who do you think introduced President Kennedy to the crowd in the parking lot? Who do you guess? Anybody want to take a guess? Who do you have there? What's he doing there? Who? Very good. Vice President Johnson introduces him, but guess who's standing right there with him? Connally and Yarborough. He's got them all together with big smiles on their face, acting like they like each other. And that's what he was doing. So as they're giving this impromptu speech, Vice President Johnson introduces him, and Vice President Johnson is accompanied by both Senator Yarborough and Governor Connally. They're all, you'll see them when I show you the video. Well, he starts out his speech with one of the bigger quotes you hear, as people are glad he's there. He says, quote, "There are no faint hearts in Fort Worth." And he starts to give his speech and the crowd starts going, Jackie, 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 Jackie. They're really maybe more interested in seeing her. And he listens. He's sucking it in because he knows that she's a big draw, and he's letting them do that. And they're saying, Jackie, Jackie, before he's giving his speech. Well, finally, he kind of gets him to quiet down, and he says, "Mrs. Kennedy is organizing herself. It takes her longer, but of course she looks better than we do when she does." Kind of acknowledges what she's doing. They quiet down, and he gives his speech. Now, this is pretty interesting because Mrs. Kennedy had not planned to go to the Chamber of Commerce banquet. That was not what she was going to do. But after he went down to that parking lot and people were chanting Jackie, he could see pretty clearly that the people were eager to see her. So what he did is he gives this short speech to the people in the parking lot, and he enters the grand ballroom of the Hotel Texas to give his speech, which was scheduled for 9 o'clock. So he goes into the ballroom and gets ready. What does he do then? Before he gives his speech, what's he do? Close. He gets Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who is Jackie Kennedy's personal Secret Service agent. He's responsible for her safety, and you'll hear a ton about him in the future. And he tells someone to get the word to Hill that he would like Jackie to join him at the head table at the breakfast. So she was not scheduled to be at the speech, but because he could see how popular she was, a word was sent to Secret Service agent Clint Hill, and he was sent back to the hotel to ask Jackie to join her husband at the head table of the grand ballroom of the Hotel Texas. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the crowd that was going to listen to him. This is really kind of interesting. Guess who most of the attendees were? Do you want to take a guess? What type of people were they? Huh? What'd you say? No, absolutely not. Wealthy. What party? You'd think Democrats, Republicans. Most of the crowd were wealthy Republicans who didn't share Kennedy's views really in any which way or how. So back at the grand ballroom, as Kennedy waits for his wife to show, the breakfast crowd isn't really gelling with the president or his political views. Because ironically, the breakfast was attended by mainly wealthy Republicans, most who, or maybe all, that didn't even vote for him in 1960. But they paid because they wanted to see him. That tells you a little bit more about his popularity, right? Now, this is kind of interesting too, because you know how many invitations were sent to black people for this originally? Do you want to take a guess? Not a hard guess. 0. Not one black person was invited. And sensing that this might be a problem for the president, and this happened prior to him getting there obviously, organizers of the breakfast speech sent word to a local prominent black man and gave him 2 tickets to come to the banquet. 2 complimentary tickets. What do you think he did? Well, no. He refused them unless they gave him at least 50. I'm not showing up to be your token black person, but I'll come if you give me 50 tickets so we have at least 50 black people there. That's what he did. The man was given 2 invitations, demanded 50 tickets for black guests to the event. So, when he got there were a few black people there. Not a lot, and I'm sure the wealthy Republicans at that time in history were wondering what in the world they were doing there, to be honest. Well, after President Kennedy arrived at the head table of the grand ballroom, he was entertained by the Texas Boys Choir of Fort Worth, specialty group, Marshalls of the Texas Boys Choir. In other words, you guys get invitations, right, to sing different places because you're really good. Well, this was a very high quality boys choir from Fort Worth, and they were asked, which was a tremendous honor, to sing before the president's speech. So the ballroom is going to be entertained by the Texas Boys Choir of Fort Worth. And they're scheduled to just sing just one song, "The Eyes of Texas Are Upon You." Anybody heard that? The eyes of Texas are upon you all the livelong day. You ever heard that? Because you're too young. Maybe your grandparents have heard it. But anyway, that's the song they were going to sing. The eyes of Texas are upon you. Well, they got done with their song, and what'd they do? What do you think they did? Huh? Sang another one. Why? No. Well, they want to see that isn't there yet. Yeah, they're stalling for time because Jackie hasn't arrived yet. So because Mrs. Kennedy had not arrived, the boys' choir sang another song. Well, they got done with that song, still no Mrs. Kennedy. So they made the decision to introduce Vice President Johnson to the crowd to kind of stall for a little more time. So they introduced Vice President Johnson, and they were getting kind of nervous because who was the next one to get introduced? President Kennedy. And just before they were going to stand up and introduce the president, Mrs. Kennedy appears at the grand ballroom. She's escorted by Secret Service agent Clint Hill and received a standing ovation from the 2,500 guests at the ballroom. I have a great picture right here signed by Clint Hill, and this is the picture of him leading Jackie Kennedy into the chamber of breakfast that morning. So anyway, she enters, escorted by Clint Hill, her personal Secret Service agent, and she receives a standing ovation from the 2,500 guests. I want you to take a look at this and you'll see more of it. She was dressed in a strawberry colored suit with a purplish collar, very distinct pillbox hat, which she was famous for wearing. And that suit, which you can see back there in the corner, kind of by the flag, is a suit that will live in infamy, that people will see that image of that suit from this point on until they get back to Washington, D.C. after the president's assassination. She never takes the suit off that whole time it changes, and you'll really be concerned when you hear the rest of the story. So she's dressed in a strawberry pink suit with a nubby weave and a purplish blue collar with the pillbox hat that she was famous for bringing into style. Well, after Mrs. Kennedy was seated, the president was introduced, and he began his speech with this following quote. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, 2 years ago, I said when introduced in Paris that I was the man who accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting somewhat that same sensation as I travel around Texas." And what he's saying is he's not President Kennedy, he's the man escorting Mrs. Kennedy. Okay? That's how it was. And he was very good with that kind of wit, and people got a good idea about that. And then he paused and smiled, and you'll see this, and he says, "Nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear," because women were modeling their fashions, including hairdos, after Jackie Kennedy. It was a huge deal. And women were getting what they called the Jackie do. Everybody had a hairstyle like Jackie Kennedy and were wearing clothes like she did, you can go online right now on eBay and look up Jackie Kennedy jewelry and see all the reproductions of the jewelry that she wore that you can buy in 2018. Still as popular as ever. So anyway, he begins his speech, he gets serious in his speech, and he says in his speech, really good, he says, "I don't think we are fatigued or tired. We would like to live as we once lived, but history will not permit it. The communist balance of power is still strong. The balance of power is still on the side of freedom. We are still the keystone in the arc of freedom. And I think we continue to do what we have done in our past, our duty. And the people of Texas will be in the lead, so I'm glad to come." And then he left. Well, he didn't leave yet. At 9:50 after his speech, President Kennedy was presented with a 10-gallon cowboy hat by Raymond E. Buck, who is the president of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. Gave him a 10-gallon hat. Does that make sense that you'd give the president a gift like that? Well, I don't know if you know much about the president, but he was not much of a hat wearer. Okay? You very seldom ever saw President Kennedy wearing a hat. He wore a hat briefly during his inauguration parade, tipped it to his father, but he wasn't a big hat wearer. Well, of course, what did the crowd do as soon as he was handed the hat? Wanted him to put it on. And so what he did, he actually asked the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce to put it on instead, which he did. And he thought he was kind of getting off the hook, and when he handed the hat back, people continued to urge him to put this hat on. And he didn't want to put it on. He wasn't going to look like a dope in his mind. You know, he's got this Eastern tailored look, and he's going to put this great big 10-gallon cowboy hat. He's not going to do that. So what he says, as the crowd still urges him to put the hat on, he says, "I'll put it on in the White House on Monday. If you come up there, you'll have a chance to see it then." So that's how he got himself out of it. And they gave a final prayer to the president, wishing him a safe trip. And then he and Jackie stopped to thank the members of the Texas Boys Choir because they were so taken by him. Now this is a great story. One of the members of that boys' choir was a 9-year-old by the name of Gary Bakewell. Gary Bakewell was a 9-year-old that was a member of the Texas Boys Choir of Fort Worth. And as the president went up and made contact with these boys, he shook Bakewell's hand. And Bakewell was so nervous, he goes, "Hi, my name's Gary Bakewell, and I'm Catholic." And the president looked at him and smiled and said, "I'm Catholic too." And the president then asked Bakewell what he wanted to be when he grew up, a 9-year-old. He goes, "I'm going to be a pilot." And the president reminds him that he's going to have to study his science and his math and his arithmetic and those types of things to become a pilot. You know what Gary Bakewell went on to become? A pilot. At 10:14 a.m. of that morning in Fort Worth, the Kennedys arrived back at their hotel suite to prepare for the trip to Dallas. They go back to their hotel suite to prepare for the trip to Dallas. President Kennedy called a guy, and you might remember this, I'm not sure, called a guy by the name of John Nance Garner. And I told you when we were talking about the Franklin Roosevelt administration that this guy would come back up in the Kennedy assassination lecture, and he wished John Nance Garner a happy 95th birthday. John Nance Garner is right up there, not a great picture, but a signature. Anybody remember who John Nance Garner was, who would have been 95 in 1963? John Nance Garner had something to do with the Roosevelt administration. Roosevelt was elected president how many times? 4. He was one of Franklin Roosevelt's vice presidents, John Nance Garner. And Kennedy got back to his hotel suite at 10:14 and took the time to call John Nance Garner. He actually had served 2 terms as vice president under Franklin Roosevelt. Well, at 10:40 a.m., the presidential party left the Hotel Texas en route to Carswell Air Force Base. 10:40, they left the Hotel Texas en route to Carswell Air Force Base. And there'd be a short flight to Dallas. And during that short flight to Dallas, who does President Kennedy sit down next to have kind of a short, blunt chat with? No, close. No, you've got one left. Connolly. He sits next to Governor Connolly, summons him into his cabin, and they have a 3-minute conversation. And what does Kennedy say to Connolly? Connolly, not Yarborough, not Johnson. What's he say to Connolly? You know what you're going to do, John? You're going to make sure that Senator Yarborough has a seat at that head table in Austin, and you're going to invite him to your little reception after this day is over. And in return for that, Yarborough's going to get in that limousine with Lyndon Johnson, and he's going to be in that boat. Now you make sure that all happens for me when we land. That's what he did. 3-minute conversation. Told Governor Connolly, you will make sure that he has a ticket to the dinner in Austin, and you will make sure that he's invited to your reception, and you will make sure that Yarborough gets in that car with Lyndon Johnson when we get to Dallas. Can you do that for me? And what is Connolly going to say? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay, that ends the Texas tour prior to Dallas. Now here's what we got in store for tomorrow. I'm going to show you a video on exactly what we've talked about this far, and I want to talk about it briefly. You ever heard of Bill Paxton? Anybody know who Bill Paxton is? If you look at his picture, I bet you, what? Actor. He was in a lot of movies. You come up here and take a look at him, you'll recognize him. Well, it just so happens during the parking lot speech in Fort Worth that Kennedy had, he was a 9-year-old boy in the crowd. And he narrates this video that I'm going to show you. And unfortunately, he died last year, complications from surgery. And if you come up and take a look at him, you'll recognize him. He was in Fort Worth on his dad's shoulders during the breakfast parking lot speech. And he's going to give a narration of this whole thing. So we're going to watch some video tomorrow, and then we're going to continue on a little bit. So we're not going to lecture and test. We'll test you when the time comes. Now, you guys kind of getting this, that my importance isn't so much to test you to see what you know right away. This is a kind of a big story I'm telling you. So I don't know, what you're getting down your notes. I'm looking, some of you are writing and some of you are listening. I think both are good. And I think probably listening maybe would be more important than the writing part. Okay? And then we'll get, when we have an evaluation of what you know, we'll make sure you know what I want you to know. But it's just kind of a story. So, but we've been through this, and I'm going to show you the video tomorrow, and you'll hear from these people I've talked about that had the chance meeting of the President or the First Lady during that trip to San Antonio, Houston, and Fort Worth. Okay? All right. Perfect.